This video is in two parts. The first part will explain how I feed and maintain the sourdough starter. The second part will cover how I prepare my sourdough starter before baking bread, which is often called the Levain. This is the starter I created in my last video, which was about creating a sourdough starter from scratch. I'll put a link in the description to that video. In that video, it took about 7 days to get a nice active sourdough starter. It's been about 4 days since that video, so this starter is about 11 days old. I will show you how I maintain my starters. I have two main methods. One is feeding them every day, and the other is putting the starter in the fridge until 2 days before I use it. I wouldn't recommend using the fridge method until your sourdough starter is matured, so roughly 2 weeks. But it's a method that I would suggest if you're only baking once per week. Ultimately, the decision is up to you. I feed my starter with a ratio of 1 part starter to 10 parts flour and water if I'm feeding it every day. This is pretty much the scrapings from the jar from the previous bake. When it comes to feeding your starter, I suggest learning the basics of fermentation and temperatures. If the weather is cold, the starter will take longer to rise. If your house is warmer, it will rise much faster. This is important because we want to catch the starter when it's finished rising for the day and about to collapse. If we leave it too long, the starter will become too acidic, and that will cause issues with your bakes. To achieve the best results, you'll need to adjust the temperatures and feeding ratios until your starter is about to collapse every 24 hours. This can easily be managed with a bit of tweaking. I add some rough guides on the screen that will work for me, but keep in mind they might be slightly different in your environment. In this tutorial, I will be feeding my starter 1 to 10 to 10, which is pretty much the scrapings from the jar like I said before, as this best suits my environment. It takes about 20 hours to fully rise and start to collapse. I see a lot of people feeding their starters a ratio 1 to 1 to 1 or 1 to 2 to 2. This would rise and start collapsing after 4 to 8 hours. Then your starter would be hungry about 2/3 of the day, causing it to become more acidic. This will be fine if you don't mind feeding your starter twice or maybe 3 times a day. If your house is very cold, you might need to use a lower ratio of starter to flour and water. Remember, you want to make sure you're feeding your starter when it's ready to be fed. If you feed it too soon, you can dilute or weaken your starter. So you want to make sure that it's risen and starting to collapse. If you see any kind of curve on top of your starter, like a hump, it's not ready to be fed yet. Another reason I like to use a very low ratio of starter to flour and water is that when you make a starter, part of that old starter goes into your new starter. If you leave the starter too long between feeds, it can become too acidic. And you can tell by the smell if your starter is too acidic. It will start to smell like vinegar. Feeding a small ratio means you're only bringing a small amount of the old starter to the new one, meaning that any acidity that does come along will be diluted. So this is my sourdough starter, which I'm feeding a ratio 1 to 10 to 10. Fed this about 20 hours ago, maybe 21. Hasn't completely peaked, but it's about to. Still got a little bit of a curve. So I will feed this in about an hour or so, the ratio 1 to 10 to 10, 1 part flour, 10 parts water, 10 parts flour. And that will be it for today. And tomorrow I'll do the same thing. And then when I want to use it, I will increase its size and turn it into Levain, which I will also explain. So this is how I would feed a 1 to 10 to 10 ratio, which would be a daily feed. 5 grams of starter, 50 grams of water. You want to break down the starter into the water, 50 grams of flour, stir it in, and add it to the jar, like so. And that's it. Only need to feed it once per day. Now you're not going to get the ratios perfect on the first go, but keep playing with it, and finally you'll find the right temperature, the right ratio for flour to water that works for you, that you only need to feed once per day. Now I will show you how to feed it if you leave it in the fridge. So last night in Sydney, it was very cold. It's 18 degrees. and I thought it would be 23 degrees or 22 last night. So my starter is not where it should be. It should be about there. Because I fed this a 1 to 10 ratio, thinking it will be a lot warmer. I'll just wait, it doesn't matter. But this just goes to show what the ratios, but the ratios do matter. And if I would have known beforehand that it was going to be 18, I would have fed this 1 to 5 to 5 instead of 1 to 10 to 10. So let's say, for example, I don't want to bake this week and I want to leave my starter in the fridge. I want to feed it at least once a week. So I will pour it out with just the scrapings. If it has no scrapings, then empty it out. So you've only got scrapings. Then I'm going to feed this a 1 to 10 to 10 ratio. If it's winter, I would feed it a 1 to 5 to 5 ratio. So let me put 50 in here. Just blend it into the water. Then I'll put my 50 grams of flour and I'll mix it in. Like so. You see, you need once a week for it to rise. So I'll leave this out overnight, and then in the morning I'll put it in the fridge. And next week I will scrape out all the starter and then feed it again. So now I'll explain how I create my levain without recording every feeding step, as you already understand the process. Essentially, a levain is an offshoot of your starter, used specifically for baking bread. It's important to keep your starter and levain separate to avoid accidentally using all your starter in one go. But if you want to just use your starter, just make sure to keep some left over for your next bake. So what's the difference between a levain and a starter? A starter is what you maintain and feed regularly, and a levain is a portion of the starter fed and prepared for a baking session. Yeah, I know it's confusing. It confused me too when I first started baking sourdough. They are basically the same thing. A levain is just a nice word to use for a starter being prepared for baking. This is how I create my levain. Timings may be a little different for you. Use my charts from earlier in the video for guidance. 2 days before baking, I take 5 grams of my starter, which I feed daily, or the starter that I have stored in the fridge. Then I feed the starter at a ratio of 1 to 10 to 10. This is to reduce the acidity, so we are starting from a good point. I'll leave this for roughly 20 to 24 hours. Then I will feed at a 1 to 2 ratio to increase the size and get more activity. Then roughly 6 hours later, just before baking, I will feed at a ratio of 1 to 1 to 1. This all depends on how much sourdough you are making. If you're only making 1 sourdough, then 1 to 1 to 1 would be fine. And if you want to make 2, maybe 1 to 2 to 2. While you can feed your starter twice before baking, I prefer feeding it 3 times to really get my levain active and to increase the levain size, depending on my batch. And that's it. That's how I make my levain. In the next video, I'll show you how I make a simple sourdough using this levain. So stay tuned. They should come out next week or hopefully the week after. And if you have any questions, just leave me a comment and I'll try and get back to it as fast as possible. Thanks for watching the video.